So today is Tuesday, the 12th of December, and it's the 66th day of the war. And I welcome today Jason Brodsky, who is the Policy Director of United Against Nuclear Iran, a non-partisan Washington-based NGO formed of policy experts and distinguished former government officials, which aims to combat the Iranian threat. He's also a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute's Iran program, and his research specialties involve Iran leadership dynamics, Iran's military and security services, and its proxy and partner network. So a very distinguished expert with me today. Thank you for joining me, Jason.
Thanks, Jake. It's great to be with you and the Jewish Chronicle.
So let's start with the big picture and the current picture, if you will. Give me a sense of the security scene across the Middle East and further afield with respect to Iran and the conflict in Gaza. There's been a lot of reports in the news of Houthi strikes on various ships in the Red Sea and elsewhere. So just paint us a picture of what's going on right now.
Sure. Well, I think we see as Israel is making progress in its war against Hamas after the atrocities committed on October 7th, that the axis of resistance, which is the Iran's proxy and partner network, has been carefully calibrating its escalation within the region to match the Israeli progress in Gaza. And that is a very typical modus operandi of the Iranian leadership. They don't go all in with one big bang. They gradually escalate. And so that's what we are seeing across multiple theaters. We're seeing it in Lebanon as well, with almost daily rocket and drone fire against Israel. We see it in Iraq with the also almost daily attacks against U.S. forces there. We see it in Syria, again, against U.S. forces. And we are also increasingly seeing it coming from Yemen. With attacks against the maritime sector, with ships that have and some kind of an Israeli nexus, either with an ownership connection or those who have docked in Israeli ports. And there have also been missiles and drones fired at U.S. And French warships from Yemen, and that is a serious escalation. So we are seeing Iran gradually test red lines, and my concern is that there is an absence of deterrence in the region, and the Iranian leadership is not being made to pay a meaningful price for the destabilization it's wreaking across the Middle East.
Right. I mean, it's interesting that in normal times, any one of these events, whether it was an attack on a US base in Iraq, whether it was a Houthi drone or missile attacking a Norwegian steamer in the Red Sea or whatever, would be front page news, would be a serious destabilizing influence. But because of what's going on in Gaza, everything has suddenly become proportional to that. Now, it's interesting what you say about the Iranian playbook as being a case of gradual escalation and testing boundaries rather than one big bang. Perhaps an unfortunate metaphor, but yes. We've seen that with the nuclear program, haven't we? Where they incrementally push the boundaries and see where they can find a new normal and then push it on a little bit more. Do you feel that's what's going on here with these relatively minor attacks taking place across the region?
Yes, I do. I think that what we are seeing is the Iranian leadership trying to engage in combat indirectly with U.S. forces and also Israel that's below the threshold of what would trigger a strike on Iranian territory. And that's what it does. And that's what I say, that we have a deterrence problem with the Islamic Republic, meaning that these strikes that it's undertaking in the region are very cheap for the Iranian leadership. It's very easy for them to do so because they're deniable. The U.S. Hits back on a handful of occasions, and when it does, it's mostly focusing on empty ammunition depots and other sites that have really no strategic importance for the Iranian leadership. And so it's very cheap, these undertakings, and this encourages the Supreme Leader and the IRGC to gradually push the envelope. And as you mentioned, we see it on the nuclear file as well. Iran has made strides and crossed what were thought to be red lines that if you are asking experts a decade ago, many would have said that they would have triggered a military strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. For example, 60% enriched uranium, kicking out or severely curtailing IAEA inspections. So, this is all part of that gradual escalation. They play a long game.
Right. And it's important to distinguish that between the military doctrine used by Israel, for example, which over the last few years has had a policy of a campaign between the wars, whereby outside of wartime, there have been regular airstrikes, particularly in Syria, to prevent the buildup of Iranian forces there in order to keep a lid on things so that there isn't a situation where suddenly you're faced with an Iranian army in Syria and you have to fight a real war. So the Israeli policy has been to try to contain and de-escalate, whereas the Iranian policy is trying to push the threshold up and up incrementally until suddenly your threshold meets war.
Right. And, I would say this, I think it's very interesting. If we look at some of the Israeli military doctrine or a security doctrine as well, we saw some very sophisticated and significant attacks on Iran proper during the prime ministership of Naftali Bennett. It's called the Octopus doctrine, and he had spearheaded that. His view and thesis, and I think this is largely correct, was that striking the head of the octopus would cause the Iranian leadership to be more risk averse in its campaigns across the region. And so we haven't seen that as much with Bibi Netanyahu in office. And I think that that's an interesting nuance. And I do think I would like the United States to adopt the octopus doctrine, because if we're just aiming at the tentacles of the Iranian octopus or the Islamic Republic's octopus, that is not going to change the fundamental calculus of the Iranian leadership.
Right. And it seems to me as if the American approach, if we can talk about that under Joe Biden, has not just been the opposite of the octopus doctrine. It's been feeding the octopus doctrine and feeding it in large wads of cash, as far as I can see. Can you talk a little bit about the American program with respect to Iran before October the 7th? What America was trying to do to, quote unquote, de-escalate the situation with Iran?
Well, I think that U.S.-Iran policy has been a failure for a long time now. And let's go back to 2021. When Joe Biden took office, he came in saying that he wanted to return to mutual compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal. And those negotiations dragged out over years. The Iranians slow-rolled the negotiations, were taking advantage of U.S. patience and U.S. willingness to engage. They made advances in their nuclear program, hardened the program, and hollowed out the terms, really, of the JCPOA, all while the United States was being quite lax in its enforcement of sanctions. And our organization, United Against Nuclear Iran, has calculated that the Iranian leadership since 2021 has earned $80 billion in oil revenue, even while sanctions were on the books, due to lax in sanctions enforcement on the part of Washington. And so that had really undermined U.S. leverage to get to the diplomatic arrangement it wanted with the Islamic Republic. And then the JCPOA negotiations really collapsed at the beginning of the Woman Life Freedom revolution in Iran. And I think that that, coupled with the Iran's entry into the war in Ukraine with supplying Russia with drones, changed the threat perception of Europe. And the JCPOA just became no longer viable. Reviving it did, and it didn't. And so, and then the U.S. really turned to what I call a de-escalation framework. And what we mean by that is trying to come up with informal understandings, if you will, with the Islamic Republic to de-escalate ahead of the 2024 presidential election in the United States, to keep the Iran file off President Biden's desk. And that failed because look at what we're seeing now in the Middle East. And so I think that this just shows you that the United States, and I would also say our European allies as well, lack a transatlantic, durable, comprehensive policy on targeting and combating the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's mired in assumptions that are faulty and no longer hold with respect to the Islamic Republic, and we do need a reset.
Right, and let's look in a bit more detail at that de-escalation strategy, which has been dominant from the United States perspective over the past year or so. It's important for listeners and viewers to understand just how powerful that was. We saw that the most high-profile element of it was the hostage deal, where a number of US hostages were released from Iran at a going rate of something like $1.2 billion a hostage. Yeah. That $6 billion was released from a South Korean escrow account, a frozen sanctions account, to the Iranians. But there are also other pots of money in play as well. There was $10 billion in Iraq, as far as I understand it, which now I think has been released to the Iranians, and other pots of money in play as well. At the same time, the US has been turning a blind eye to oil exports from Iran, allowing the Iranians to sell a lot to the Chinese and make a lot of money that way, all of which that money is not going to the Iranian people. It might be used, come with conditions that means that you've got to buy stuff rather than use it to buy arms, but you've got to buy actual goods. But then that just frees up resources elsewhere. To what extent has the October the 7th events, if I can use that understatement, affected that policy of de-escalation, do you think?
I think it's failed. I think that let's also look at one of the components of the de-escalation framework that you outlined was that the Islamic Republic would halt attacks on US forces in Iraq and Syria. That went out the window with October 7th. And so we still, as the US government, haven't ramped up our sanctions enforcement. The last energy sanctions enforcement announcement from the Treasury Department was in March 2023. It's now December. So that shows you that we have not really carefully calibrated or adjusted, I should say, our policy to match the new reality. And I know that there's been this informal understanding with the Qataris to put a hold on the $6 billion to not make it accessible to the Islamic Republic. But there's a lot of confusion over that. And I know there's a now movement in the Congress to formally put that off limits and take that out of the hands of Tehran. But nevertheless, we have not been able to, as a country, to come to the conclusion that there is never going to be Middle East peace. There's never going to be peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians without dealing with the threat from Iran. And that without changing our posture and changing our policy with respect to that, we're just going to be falling into the same traps that we have in the past with Tehran.
Right. So that's interesting. So you're saying that the $6 billion in the South Korean account, I know it was put on pause after October the 7th, while the administration tried to work out the extent of Iranian involvement in October the 7th. But my understanding was that it has subsequently been released after the Iranians were given a clean bill of health with respect to planning the attacks. Is that correct or is that incorrect?
I haven't heard that. I mean, our understanding is that, and the people I speak with on the Hill is that, that Congress is still trying to make it so that that pot of money is not accessible to Islamic Republic. So but this is what I'm saying. There's all this confusion about that arrangement, and there's also no accountability. U.S. officials have not been have not gone public as to what their goals are with respect to the Islamic Republic. The president has not given any speech on Iran. I don't think the President Biden likes to speak about Iran. He rarely does, and when he does, it's only a brief moment. He speaks about it in one sentence and wants to move on to a different topic. That is, there's just a lot of confusion with his policy. And when there's confusion, that breeds conspiracy theories and a toxic dynamic in the Iran conversation in this town. And that is not a healthy policy dynamic, unfortunately.
Right. And in fact, I heard from sources here in the UK that the final aim of the de-escalation strategy that Washington has been pursuing was to return Iran to the negotiating table for the JCPOA. So with all this money flowing through their system and trust being rebuilt and the de-escalation taking place, then you can go back to that policy which fell apart years and years ago. I mean, what's going on with this dogged determination to try to salvage the JCPOA? Is it just vanity? Is it wanting to erase the memory of the Trump years by putting the Obama years back on track? Or do they really think that it's going to work? Or are they out of ideas?
I think that, first of all, I think it's important to distinguish the JCPOA of 2015 with diplomacy writ large with the Islamic Republic. The JCPOA of 2015 is dead. That the text of that agreement no longer holds. The provisions have already started to expire. So that is no longer reviving that. The four corners of that document is not on the table.
Right.
But
the sunset clauses are already upon us, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And some people have said that you know, the 6 billion, making the 6 billion accessible to the Islamic Republic and some of these other de-escalatory steps were provided a key or to a broader diplomatic opening with the Islamic Republic, where we would then sit down with them and and discuss the other issues that we have of concern, most notably the nuclear file. It was considered a gateway to diplomacy with the Islamic Republic for another JCPOA framework deal where there would be sanctions relief in exchange for temporary constraints on Iran's nuclear program. And so, but I agree with you. We keep making these same mistakes with respect to that JCPOA framework. It didn't work in the 2015 deal because for two reasons. Number one is there was no bipartisan consensus in Washington as to what an acceptable deal would look like with the Islamic Republic, if there would ever be an acceptable deal with the Islamic Republic. And that was the first issue that challenged the JCPOA. And the second issue that challenged the JCPOA is that the full panoply of Iranian destabilization and malign behavior in non-nuclear areas would always put stress on whatever nuclear understanding was inked with Tehran. And so the idea that you could segregate the nuclear file from all these other different concerns that we have, I think is fanciful, and expect it to last is just fanciful, because the money that Iran earns from the sanctions relief is going to be used to aggravate these other areas of concern, and the U.S. doesn't have any leverage then to tackle them because we're giving sanctions relief for this nuclear deal. So this is the fundamental construct of the deal is faulty, and so that's why the Trump administration withdrew from it.
Right. Well, let's talk about the Trump administration a little bit, because the Trump administration withdrew from it and replaced it with this policy of maximum pressure, which was full-fat sanctions, which really did curtail or wither the tentacles of the octopus, or it began to do that over time. But its critics have said that it did not serve to slow the progress of the nuclear program. In fact, a lot of progress was accelerated during the Trump years, even during maximum pressure. Now we're looking at 2024 that may see at the end of the year a return of Donald Trump. What's your analysis of what happened last time with maximum pressure and what may happen if Trump re-enters the White House?
Well, I would disagree with the notion that Iran made its greatest nuclear strides during the Trump administration. I think Iran made its greatest nuclear strides during the Biden administration. And if you look at the history of the nuclear file, that will bear out. Iran started rapidly expanding its program, specifically enriching to 60%, advances with uranium metal when the Biden administration was in office. And
Right,
so,
but the point is that the Trump doctrine of maximum pressure didn't actually stop the program. It still made rapid progress. Is that my
yeah,
point?
yeah, no, I understand that right, but we also have to look at, did it result in a war? No. This was the false dichotomy or the false choice that the Obama administration put out in 2015. It's either this deal or war. And so I don't subscribe to that. I think that there are other kinds of policies and frameworks that that we can have that based on deterrence that don't necessarily involve a war, particularly given that the Islamic Republic does not want to get in a war with the United States, because if it does, the United States wins. So that is, I think that that false choice was unfortunate, simplistic, and only really served Iranian interests, not the United States.
Right, and Trump famously called the Iranian bluff with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which, according to the establishment diplomats of the Obama era, that would have filled them with horror and would have meant World War III. In actual fact, it didn't. Iran wasn't really able to respond.
Right. And I would add, they had like you had at the time, people were saying this was going to be a Franz Ferdinand moment, likening it to the beginning of World War I. I mean, it was just the rhetoric was hyperbolic and out of control, and the reality was very much very different.
Right. And in a way, we're now seeing, it seems to me, something a little similar, which is that the Israeli progress in Gaza has been rapid and powerful. And people are talking today and yesterday about a possible collapse. It feels like for Hamas, the end may, and I'm saying may, be in sight. And it feels like that is really making Iran and Hezbollah think twice in a similar way to when Trump killed Soleimani. Do you think that that is the case, or do you think that something else is going on in the minds of the Iranians?
I think that Israel's campaign in Gaza also sends a message to Hezbollah and Tehran. And that's why it's important to allow Israel the space to carry out and take Hamas out. It sends a message to the broader axis of resistance that they better not try what Hamas did on October 7th, or they're going to be next. And I think that this is especially true with Lebanon and Hezbollah. And so I do think that they've been deterred from getting involved in a very significant way. Yes, they've been firing and gradually escalating, but they have been not trying to open up the northern front in a full manner. So that progress from the Israelis in Gaza is also a signal to the broader region, and that's why it's important that Israel continue.
Right. And so this brings us really to the most chilling question, which is that before October the 7th, a lot of the headlines vis-a-vis Iran were about the progress of its nuclear program. And I believe the latest headline from that period was that it was 2 weeks off the fissile material sufficient for a bomb. Since October the 7th, we've had that to think about, and the Iranian agitation around the region to contend with. But there's been not one single headline picking up the thread of the progress of their nuclear program. I would have thought that the Iranians are pursuing that at some pace, with the benefit of the cover and the distraction to which they are contributing via the Houthis and others in Iraq and elsewhere. What do you think about that greater threat that nobody's talking about?
Well, I think it certainly continues. It's not going away. Tehran continues to add to its stockpile of 60% uranium, enriched uranium. And that just goes to show you that I think that the reason that they've made all this progress is they've not been paid a meaningful price for any of their escalation thus far. And that's why I think that it would be important for the United States to really shock the Iranian system out of its complacency and mindset that gradual escalation is acceptable. And the only way that's going to happen is if the United States starts targeting the IRGC on Iranian soil. We have to shock the system out of this, lull them out of this complacency that the Biden administration is just going to sit back and allow them to target our forces because they're afraid of starting another war in the Middle East. And that you have to reverse that calculation in order to get Tehran to restrain itself in the region. And right now, we're not doing that. So it's going to have to take a shock to the system to do just that.
So when you say targeting the IRGC and a shock to the system, are you talking about a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, or are you talking about a strike on their military bases or their arms depots or their military infrastructure or within Iran? What does that
military bases in Iran. And that would help with deterrence on the nuclear file as well, because it would demonstrate to the Iranian leadership that we not only have the capability to strike, but the will to do so. And that would really reset the deterrence equation with respect to Tehran, in my view. And so that's what I mean. We have to shock them. We have to do something out of character. And that's what the Trump administration was quite good at. They shocked the Iranians with the Soleimani strike. And that's what I think the Biden administration needs to do. I'm skeptical we'll ever get there, unfortunately, but in my view, that's what needs to happen.
And if we see Trump returning to the White House, that's much more likely.
Well, I think that he's unpredictable. So I think that you will see a caution from Tehran as to how far it pushes the envelope. Much more caution than it exhibits today with Trump there. And so, you know, I remember when Nasrallah gave a speech once when Trump was in office, and he thought Trump was crazy. So that perception of the U.S. president, the madman perception, if you will.
Doctrine, yeah,
exactly, is actually made the Iranian system and its proxies more risk averse than risk ready as it is under the Biden administration.
Right. Fascinating. Okay, just one more
Sure.
area to talk before I let you go, if that's all right, Jason.
Sure.
It's just about the geopolitical alliances that we see reforming themselves and developing across the region at the moment. October the 7th has changed a lot of things. Before October the 7th, the Saudis were, as we're led to understand, on the verge of signing the Abraham Accords. That, at the very least, has been put on pause. And we saw the Saudis snubbing Rishi Sunak last week in favor of a meeting with Vladimir Putin, who, of course, is a key part of this axis of resistance, as you describe it, with China, with Iran, and North Korea, and others. To what extent do you think the world is becoming polarized into an axis and allies, if I can use that metaphor, type arrangement? And to what extent do you think it's still a three-dimensional power game, with the UAE, for example, being in the Abraham Accords but buying oil from Iran and so on and so forth?
I think that there's no doubt that Iran, Russia, China are tightening their partnerships and relations. That's absolutely happening, and it's becoming a more lethal and potent threat. I don't think that Saudi Arabia is going to change its fundamental strategic objective of trying to normalize ties with Israel, even with what happened on October 7th. I think that strategic goal remains. It's been put on hold for now. I think that we've pumped, the Saudis and the Israelis have pumped the brakes because of Gaza, but I think that the interests of doing so still remain. And so I think you'll see Saudi continue to hedge by trying to, solidify the normalization in ties with Iran, to prevent any Iranian escalation against Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia's focused on Vision 2030 and its economic interests. And the Crown Prince wants to make sure nothing distracts from those goals. And so that's part of why they normalize ties with the Iranians. I don't think that they're under any illusion that they're going to be able to have a rapprochement with Tehran as long as Khamenei is in charge. Because let's remember that in 2016, even before the Saudis and the Iranians severed relations in 2016, when they had full diplomatic ties in 2011, the Iranians tried to assassinate Saudi Arabia's ambassador at a Georgetown restaurant. So, these relations are not going to warm anytime soon, but I think that they are just trying to manage them. And I think that that's what the UAE is going to be doing as well, just trying to manage the Iranian problem, because they also have skepticism as to U.S. staying power in the region. And I think that a lot of incidents over the years have reinforced that perception that the U.S. is unreliable, sadly. And this is not a partisan comment. This is a bipartisan failure, I think. We have not, as the United States has not demonstrated that it will back up its allies and partners always with kinetic action when these interests are threatened. We can go back to the Obama administration when the JCPOA was inked. We can go back to the Trump administration with the Iranian attack on Saudi energy infrastructure and Abqaiq and Quraysh, and there was no U.S. response. And we can go back to the Biden administration when there have been several Houthi attacks and IRGC attacks against U.S. allies and partners in the region, and there has not been a U.S. response. So that is why you're seeing Saudi and the UAE hedge.
Right. So what you're calling for really is imminent and decisive strikes on Iranian soil.
On IRGC targets on Iranian soil. This is not a strike against Iran, it's a strike against the IRGC.
Okay, just a final question for you, Jason. The Arab world has been united in calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Do you think there's a single Arab state that really wants a ceasefire in Gaza?
I think a lot of the public posturing on this issue from some of our allies and partners in the Middle East, I'm talking U.S. allies and partners, is for domestic consumption because their public is very upset with the scenes that they're seeing coming from Gaza. But I don't think that, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others would mind Hamas being dislodged from Gaza. And they won't be public about that, but behind the scenes, I think that they would welcome that dynamic. So I think a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing in the public spaces for domestic consumption because of their publics. I don't really buy these doomsday scenarios that the United States is losing the region and all of these apocalyptic takes, that the United States' reputation and credibility is, shattered. Please. I think that the United States is is a huge provides a lot of aid to many of these countries, Jordan in particular, also the Palestinians. And, at the end of the day, Hamas is the reason why there are so many casualties in Gaza. They made the decision on October 7th to attack Israel. They are the ones who broke a ceasefire, not Israel. And the buck stops with them. And so I'd like to see in some of the calls from our Arab partners that for a humanitarian ceasefire, I'd like to see them say it's time for Hamas to surrender. That they should say in public, but they won't because of an attempt to manage their domestic political dynamics in their countries.
Right. I mean, it's been fascinating to me to observe that there have been far bigger demonstrations against Israel in the West than there have been in the Middle East. And it seems to me that there's far more support for Hamas in Western capitals and certainly on Western campuses than anywhere in the Middle East at all.
Yeah, an Iranian friend of mine reminded me recently, and I think it's very true, that when we're talking about Hamas and other kinds of Islamist movements, that the Islamic Republic has more supporters in the West than it does in Iran. And I think that that's very I think that holds true with other aspects and things that we're seeing play out on TV screens in the West. And I know where you are in the UK, there have been very significant protests, but I think that we have to keep that dynamic in mind.
I have no idea whether that's more encouraging or discouraging, but I'm going to go with encouraging. Let's finish the podcast on that note. Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. I'd remind our listeners to the podcast that you can also watch this on YouTube, and our YouTube viewers that you can also listen to this on the podcast. Jason Brodsky, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to be with you.